Well, welcome this morning. My name is Stephen Reed, and my wife Mary is with me today. And we arrived at Jamestown College in 1997, and we've been there since. So it's fun to hear some of you that have been graduates of Jamestown College and to meet you. And we welcome others of you that want to come and study with us as well. It's the harvest season. At least in the eastern part of the state, they're busy harvesting barley and wheat. And I see a lot of hay that's being put up in this area. And aren't those sunflower fields beautiful out there this time of year? It's a nice time of the year. And this relates well to our passage, because in this passage, God is compared to a farmer who has a vineyard. And I grew up in a farm, but I haven't farmed for many years, and I know probably many of you aren't farmers either, but certainly we have a sense of what farmers are doing as they wait for the harvest and as they anticipate what the harvest will be like. And if you've been part of a farming family, it's always, how are the crops, or how are the crops doing, or what are the prices of the crops? That pretty much consumes your life. Talking about those issues. Vines and vineyards were very important in Israel, and we even have a few vineyards in North Dakota. Grapes were one of the 7 major crops, along with wheat, barley, fig trees, pomegranates, olives, and honey. And most farmers raised grapes, which could be eaten raw, or dried as raisins, or processed as wine or vinegar. And many people in Israel would have been very familiar with vineyards. There are different usages of this vineyard imagery in the Bible. Often in the Old Testament, God is understood as the farmer, and the nation of Israel is understood as the vine. The usage in the New Testament in John 15 is a little bit different, because there Jesus says that he is the branches, or he is the vine, and we are the branches as individuals. So there's a little bit different usage of the parable. And the image can be used either to comfort people or to challenge people. In Isaiah 5, the imagery is used to describe the proper relationship between God as the farmer and Israel as the vine. And I want to talk about 3 different points in this story. First of all, God is the one who creates the vineyard and starts it out. Secondly, as a farmer, he is the one who cares for the vineyard. And thirdly, he expects to receive good fruit from the vineyard. So let's look at these 3. First of all, the vineyard belongs to the farmer. It certainly wouldn't exist without him. He makes the vineyard. He places the vineyard, often in Israel, on a hillside with terraces to hold back the water. It's situated on fertile ground, which implies probably that rich soil was brought from the valleys for the vineyards. He's loosened the soil before planting. He's removed the stones so the plants can grow. The patience of the farmer is emphasized several times in this passage. 3 times, verses 2, 4, and 7, it says that the farmer has to wait for the good fruit to come. Vineyards took a lot of care and attention. They needed to be protected and pruned so they would produce good fruit. Generally, when you plant vines, the first 4 years, you don't harvest the fruit, and it's only in the 5th year that you can harvest the grapes. And as the owner of the vineyard, the farmer certainly has the right to evaluate the produce of the work. The farmer is free to do what he wishes with the vineyard. Israel as a nation was planted by God in the promised land, given them this special land for them to grow and to nourish. And their growth was dependent upon God and his care. And God made a covenant with the people of Israel. And he said, "You will be my special people, and I have special plans for you." So they have a privileged position, but they also have responsibilities. Now, there's been quite a debate in our country about whether or not the United States is a Christian nation or not. beginning in the Civil War in 1864, they began to put "In God We Trust" on the coins. And it was only in the 50s, however, that we have "Under God" added to the Pledge of Allegiance. So it's been in the last 50 years when this has been emphasized to a great deal. One wonders what we mean when we put "In God We Trust" on our money. Sometimes I think we want God on our side and we want God's blessings, but we don't really want God to expect very much from us. We want to emphasize the goodness. And before we're too eager to claim that we want to be like Israel and like a chosen nation, we need to read our Old Testament a little more carefully, because God often brought judgment upon the nation of Israel and brought their nation to an end because they didn't meet up his expectations. Whether you really want to be the chosen people of God or not, looking at Israel, is an interesting question. All nations, I think, owe something to God for their existence. And it's easy for us to simply pat ourselves on the back and take all the credit for the goodness of a nation that we live in. Patriotism can be a good thing as long as we simply don't pat ourselves on the back and think we're superior to other people that live in poor nations. We spent 4 years in Zimbabwe, where I taught at Africa University. And I remember a Zimbabwean man coming up to me, and he said, "You know, Americans must really be godly people because you have such a wealthy and prosperous nation." And I had to stop and tell him, certainly God has blessed us a great deal, but to think that we're superior to other people around the world, that's pretty presumptuous. And to think that we're more righteous and better than people like living in Zimbabwe, that's pretty problematic. It's easy to be proud about that and think that that's the case, but that's questionable, I think. The second point in this passage is that the vineyard is dependent upon the farmer who has to care for it and protect it. Vines must have nourishment from soil for their survival. The farmer plants vines in a place where it will have the right kinds of resources. Certainly, wild grapes grow on their own, and at some point in the parable it says they were just like wild grapes, sort of living on their own and not really then being linked anymore to God. Vines are endangered by lots of threats. Wild animals, insects could attack vines. Human thieves may take the grapes. And this text talks about a watchtower, which is a way to keep watch over the vines, particularly as you get close to the harvest. The farmer protects the plants from attackers, and God is also the one who protects them. And the passage talks about if God removes his protection and allows others to come into the vineyard, then it will be virtually destroyed without God's care and God's protection. We have enemies as well. We often think of external enemies like terrorists, but also there are internal enemies. And one of the amazing things is sometimes that our wealth and our prosperity, they give us security, but sometimes they take it away from us. The more stuff we have, the more we're concerned about people taking it away from us. And we had to build fences and alarm systems to protect our stuff or hide it in the bank. If you don't have anything, you don't worry about people taking it away. But the more you have, so you have those worries and anxieties. The third point, which is probably the most important point of this passage, is the challenge to bear fruit. We enjoy the comfort and care that God extends to us, but we have to be careful we don't think of God as sort of our servant that is at our beck and call to do everything we want. He's not a kind of cosmic genie that we can rub the jar and he will give us the wishes automatically that we expect. It's interesting, during the Civil War, a minister told Abraham Lincoln that certainly God was on the side of the North because they were opposed to slavery. And Abraham Lincoln was very wisely said, it should not be a matter of whether God is on our side, but whether we are on God's side. And he was certainly very aware that there were Christians in the South as well as Christians in the North, and it was a complicated issue. There's a danger that we're sometimes lulled to complacency. We may think of the Christian life as a kind of perpetual vacation, like a cruise in the Caribbean in which our every need and desire is satisfied. We love to be snug and comfortable, and we want to be free from cares and concerns of the world. But the Christian life involves accountability and God's expectations. A farmer does not just raise crops so that they will look beautiful, even though the sunflower fields are pretty beautiful. A farmer expects the vineyards to produce fruit, and he prunes them so this would take place. The fruit which we produce is the purpose of our existence. In chapter 5 of Isaiah, the fruit produced was worthless. What would you do with a vineyard that produces worthless grapes? Probably destroy it and start over again. So God's intent is not that surprising. And we could apply this passage in different ways if we think of the nation as a whole and what the nation should produce as fruit and what we should think about as individuals and the fruit that we should produce, which is the case of John chapter 15. One can imagine the frustration of the farmer working hard and then at the end not getting a crop. And that happens to farmers. They get hail, they get tornadoes, the whole crop is destroyed, and all of that work seems to be for naught. I remember several years ago we tried to plant rose bushes. The first year they were great, the next year they were dead. And I don't know what happened. We probably weren't very good farmers. I can't blame it on the roses, but that was a waste of time. And it's hard to be patient. I think of a friend of mine in California. He and a roommate decided to plant a garden one time. He'd never done that before. And he was waiting for the potatoes, and he was impatient about, could there be potatoes? They're under the ground. You can't see the fruit. So he pulled one up. He wanted to look at the roots and see how it was doing and then replant it. Well, it doesn't work that way. You can't really replant it at that point. It takes a lot of patience with potatoes. The verdict about Israel is that he expected justice, which is in Hebrew mishpat, but saw bloodshed, mishpah, and righteousness, Hebrew tzedakah, but heard a cry, sa'akah. Now, in both of those cases, we miss it, but there's a pun that's being made on what God expects and what he ends up getting. One translation, the Jewish translation, I think, tries to capture this. And he looked for justice, but behold, injustice, for equity, but behold, iniquity. Trying to capture a little bit of that pun. Not only are the good things God expects missing, but the bad things that God hates are there. Justice and righteousness are often used in the Bible to talk about what God expects that's necessary for right order in society. And they relate to the establishment and maintenance of social equity. Justice deals with laws and the just application of those laws to people in society. Righteousness deals more with the nature of people, that they're good people. And you need both, don't you? You need good laws and you need good people in applying those laws in society. It's what we talk about often in terms of law and order. How can you have law and order in society, which makes life go so well? In contrast to righteousness, there is a cry of distress from those who suffer from political or social violence. Yahweh does not forget their cry. When there are people that must cry out to God for help, it means that there are those who are oppressing them and that justice is not being done. The people of Sodom cry out to God for help, those who are being oppressed. So what is God's final decision about Israel? He decides to abandon the vine and no longer show any interest or care in it. He allows it to go back to weeds. He allows it to go back to the wild condition. So a sad ending. So what is it that God expects from nations today? How do we evaluate ourselves? It's easy to think of our gross national product and to think how much wealth we have. Certainly in North Dakota, with the growth of the oil patch, many of us are very happy and excited about the wealth that it brings in to our society. We also might think of security and think about how safe we feel from enemies. We have one of the largest armies in the world, so we certainly have security there. We might speak about personal freedoms and ask about how well people are respected. We might think about our power and our importance around the world. There are standards of justice and righteousness that God expects of all nations and all humans. Some questions that we ought to ask ourselves: how well is our justice system working? Is it fair for all? Or do the rich and powerful have a better chance for justice than the poor? What about the distribution of wealth in our country? Does everyone have an opportunity to gain wealth? Why do the rich seem to get richer and the poor seem to get poorer? Are the poor just lazy? Do those with power and wealth take advantage of those with little power and wealth? And since we have been so involved internationally, we need to ask ourselves how well we are treating people in other countries. We often want to think that we're very benevolent to others and we expect everyone to love us and be appreciative. But they're not always appreciative. We're a powerful country, and sometimes people see our power and our army more than they see our benevolence. We have been heavily involved with wars: World War I and II, Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War I, Gulf War II, Afghanistan. Many of you, perhaps even in this congregation, have served in the army or the services. We have a powerful army that brings fear to many around the world, but sometimes that doesn't always create love for us. It creates fear. And we could go through every war that we have ever fought and raise questions about that. I don't intend to do that. And one of the things I think we realize in Iraq is, on the one hand, it was fairly easy to win a war, but it's much more difficult to help rebuild a just and equitable society. And they're still working on that, and hopefully they will be successful related to this. The image of a farmer and his vineyard helps us to understand what God expects of us in this world as members of nations. And there are three main points that relate to this metaphor that I've talked about. First, God shows his love for us as a farmer who creates a vineyard. He actually talks about a love song at the beginning of this passage in Isaiah. Secondly, God shows his care for us in protecting us from danger from enemies. But thirdly, God expects us to bear good fruit. Good fruit of a nation relates to justice and righteousness. This relates to how well we treat other people.